This is your friendly neighborhood author, Jonathan, and you are listening to Season 5 of the Floor Rejects podcast, The Isle of Artemisia. Hello, and welcome back to the Floor Rejects podcast. This is your friendly neighborhood author, Jonathan. If you're new here, or if you're just tuning in after a few weeks of being gone, every week I read a chapter of a story I'm working on. This season it is The Isle of Artemisia, and after I read the chapter to you, I give you my thoughts and opinions on the chapter, on what I've written. If you missed last week, Anaxos was missing. Barrett tried to get his friends to wait, but they didn't really want to wait to get off the island. He provided them with a boat, and Nick turned out to be a traitor. He turned out to be someone that they couldn't trust, and he chased Barrett into the woods, chased him into the cave, and almost caught him, but Barrett evaded capture, and that's kind of where we left him, was hiding in the cave. So let's get into the new chapter. Chapter 24. Firestorm. As the last dying rays of sun shone down on Barrett, he gathered the strength to pull himself from the sand and up to his feet. He had a plan to enact. He knows Nick, and likely the rest of the others, including Elliot, were looking for him, but he had to go back to the beach. He squats at the entrance to the cave, looking around. He hears no one, sees nothing. He bolts out of the cave, running towards the beach. He was running as hard and fast as he could. He doesn't trip miraculously and ends up back on the beach. There's no one in sight. No boat, no friends, no others. He runs to the fire pit and mercifully finds what he's looking for. He finds the rocks, the ones that he had watched Anaxos strike to make sparks for the fire. He looks around, still unsure whether he was truly alone. When he is sure, he begins to bang the rocks against each other. At first, nothing happens, just the hollow sound of stone on stone. Then a spark, a weak one that fizzles out. Then a second spark, stronger. It peters out after a moment. Barrett tries again, and this time the spark is so strong that it sizzles in the damp sand. Barrett smiles to himself and looks at the hut. His plan was suddenly coming into focus. He goes to the hut and sits there on his bed before striking the rocks over and over, rotating them and changing his technique until he was confident he could start a fire at a moment's notice. He looks out at the sky, seeing the clean, cloudless blue. It hadn't rained since he'd arrived on the isle. In fact, the island seemed to be very dry from what he could tell. He then pulls his bunk from the hut out next to the fire pit. Then he begins to gather brush from around the hut, wood, sticks, and leaves from the forest, anything flammable he could find. He begins to pile it on the various bunks still left inside the hut. Then, when he runs out of room, he just begins to pile driftwood and what was left nearby on the floor. Soon, the interior was spiderwebbing, full of branches and twigs that were perfect dry kindling. The sun was down now, and he doesn't bother making a fire in the fire pit. Instead, he steels himself, takes a deep breath, and strikes the rocks over the side of the hut. Sparks fall onto it, and almost immediately tiny flames begin to dance. They creep up the side of the hut, growing and spreading on the dry, crackling fronds and leaves that make it up. Then the whole hut is in flames. Barrett giggles, his plan coming to fruition quickly as thick, choking black smoke rises up into the sky. He pockets the rocks and again takes off running, this time back towards the cave. He makes it in record time, completely enthused by the fact that he was going to outsmart the others. He gathers up the materials to duplicate his stunt on the beach, this time just outside the mouth of the cave, not inside, like the last time. He doesn't want to hide the smoke this time. The fire is lit quickly. It's more modest, but enough to generate a column of smoke directly into the sky. Barrett waits a beat, then two, and then begins to run in the opposite direction towards the other beach, where they'd found the boat. He pushes himself hard, knowing that he didn't have much time. He gets to the beach and wastes no time building a third fire. The smoke quickly spirals up into the sky, and Barrett begins his slower, more deliberate creep towards the encampment in the woods. He sidles from tree to tree, hiding as he watches out for other people. Slowly, he makes his way to the camp, rolling around trees, crawling under logs, and generally making himself as invisible as possible. As he reaches the outskirts of the encampment, he watches closely for any signs of life. He sees no one, no movement. He considers starting a fire, burning the camp to the ground, but instead he rushes to the pits in the ground where he knows they must be holding an Axos. A grate is pitched over one of the holes. "X," Barrett hisses, drawing close to the hole in the ground. As he does, he hears a small moan. "An Axos," Barrett squeaks, throwing the grate away and reaching down into the hole, finding an Axos curled up on his face, his chest turned towards the ground. "Give me your hand," Barrett whispers, and an Axos looks up at him. That was fast," an Axos hisses, reaching up, his body quivering. He's got blood smeared down his arms, on his face, his chest, and as he turns in the hole, down his back as well. Barrett latches onto his arm, and then he begins to crawl, to pull as hard as he can with the little strength he had left. An Axos claws his way, almost pulling Barrett's arm out of his socket as he scrambles up and out of the hole. He crawls over the top of Barrett up onto the level earth and collapses in a quivering pile. "X, come on, we gotta go," Barrett says quietly, but an Axos doesn't move. He just lays there on the ground. "Come on," Barrett hurries, trying to pull him up, but suddenly an Axos whips around, looking at him with annoyance. "Why did you stay? You had boat," an Axos asks, his chest heaving. He was upset, and Barrett could understand why, but he didn't have time to argue that now. "We can discuss this later, but we need to get somewhere safe," Barrett says, and an Axos sighs. He begins to walk in the direction of the hut, but Barrett grabs his arm. "We need another hiding place," he says, pointing up at the pillar of smoke coming from what was now probably a smoldering pile of ash. "Fine, follow me," an Axos says, and passive-aggressively he lumbers into the woods in a new direction, not the beach they were used to, not the cave and not the boat beach, but much deeper into the woods, towards the flatter area of the island. They walk for a long time at an alarmingly leisurely pace as an Axos paces, staring into hollow logs, under stumps and around large boulders over and over, until finally he stops at a rotten tree that seemed to be conspicuously free of debris and fungus, propped up against a small rocky cliff. "What are we doing here?" Barrett asks, and an Axos holds up a hand, picking the log up and shifting it aside. Under the log is a small hole in the rock face, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. An Axos gestures at it. "Get in," he says, and Barrett looks up at him as if he'd lost his mind. Barrett begins to argue, but an Axos looks at him with exasperation. Barrett nods and leans down, crawling into what he thought was a tiny hole in the wall, but that actually opened up into a small cavern after the initial opening in the rock. An Axos quickly follows, reaching out to pull the log partially over the hole so that the pair are in almost total darkness. Barrett can barely see an Axos, but he reaches out and pulls the man close to him, down to the floor of the cavern. "I stayed because I wasn't going to let them torture you," he says, kissing an Axos sweetly. An Axos laughs bitterly. "Now you are stuck," he says, pulling back. "And now you are safe," Barrett says, kissing him back, pulling him close as the fight leaves his body and the adrenaline wears off, leaving him weak and tired in the man's arms. Slowly he loses his thoughts as he falls asleep, his body betraying his want to stay alert. And soundly he slumbers there in the little hole in the ground. What do I like about this chapter? Well, I'm sure you're used to me saying there's not much that I like about it. Has that changed this week? No, it has not. But what has changed is I'm cutting myself some slack. I think it's a good chapter, a good basis for a chapter. I have decided that I'm going to tell that company that offered me a chance to write serialized fiction that I'm not interested. And I decided that for a couple reasons, and that's why, even though this chapter is short, like I said, I was going to be practicing. Hopefully our chapters will at least return to a more full-bodied chapter from here on out. I don't like the way that the structure of that company works. I don't like that there's no creative freedom. And I don't like that it requires me to write in two completely different styles. One that's mine and one that is supposed to sell well. I just don't like it. And I don't think that that's what literature is really about, or artistic expression is artistically expressing yourself just in the way that's good for a certain medium, and not even the medium that you're actually using, if that makes sense. Like, I'm writing, but this isn't even a real writing medium, it's an internet medium. This is also an internet medium, but I've kind of adapted it to work, I think. Methinks. And so this chapter was still written when I was deciding whether I wanted to do it or not, and when I was kind of still practicing to see if I could do it. But, as I said, I'm not going to go with that company. I don't think it would be good for me. And I don't think it would be good for you. And I know there's not many of you out there. But for those of you who are out there, I appreciate it. And I feel like I've been giving you like half of a story every week. And I don't want to give you half a story. I want to give you a whole story every week. I also got a new job. And hopefully that new job is better than the job I have now. And will leave me with some time to really put some effort in to my stories, because it feels like right now I'm giving 50% effort when I should be giving 100% to you guys, because you've been there. All 15 of you have been there for a while now. But what do I like about this chapter? Again, as I say every week when something happens, I like that something happens. Number two, I like how quickly it happens. I like that Barrett is sure of himself, and while being sure of himself, has a plan that he doesn't immediately reveal to the reader, and that isn't explained to the reader so much as it just happens and the reader comes along for the ride. I like that him and Anaxos aren't like, as soon as they're back together, they're like, oh, we've got to fuck in this encampment, which is like something that this company that I'm telling to go somewhere else is something that they would expect. Is like, it's a romance novel, so of course they're going to fuck as soon as they get near each other again. You know what I mean? No. This is still a realistic portrayal of a shipwreck. You know what I mean? Like a shipwreck with crazy psychotic people on an island. It's got to make sense. And you can't abandon the entire story for the sake of the format. You'd rather abandon the format for the sake of the story. At least in my mind, that's how I would think about it. And so I like that. What else do I like? Let me go back and look. With my iPad. I got iPad. There's not too much else I like, really. I will say, as an end of the year thing, I don't know how this podcast is going to continue in the new year. Like I said, I got a new job. It doesn't start until later of next year. But until then, I don't know if I'm going to cut it down to once every other week, maybe, and do it that way for a little while and see if maybe I can get myself some more time to work on chapters just until that happens, and then until I get myself through my training and everything that I need to get through. But in this new year, I'm taking some time for me. And part of that is making time for this podcast because it's me trying to do something that I love. But it's also me stepping back and saying, sometimes I'm doing too much at once. And I don't want to do too much at once. It's just how my brain is hardwired. Like right now, I worked all day, and then right at the end of the day, to give you some perspective so it makes sense, the company that I work for now assigns me anywhere between 15 to 20, sometimes up to 25 to 30 files in a day. 30 is pretty much unheard of. 25 is pretty unheard of. 20 is a long, hard day. 15 is about where it's comfortable. Today they assigned me 26, and then 30 minutes before my shift was over, they assigned me 9 more, and expect those done by tomorrow. So most people would say, fuck you, I'm going to enjoy the rest of my day the way that I choose to enjoy it. But what I'm going to do is get off here, start editing this podcast, wait for everything to do its thing. And then I'm going to work until 11 o'clock at night so that I can sleep peacefully. Because sleep is very important to me, and I can't sleep if I don't have all my work done, even if it's work I shouldn't be doing. But I get a 3-day weekend this weekend, so that's something. I have to help my parents. They need help with something, and I volunteer. Well, I didn't volunteer. They asked me to help them, and I told them I would. So I don't really get a 3-day weekend, but you help who you can when you can. Anyway, all that's to say, the podcast is not going anywhere. But I want to give myself some flexibility. So come the new year, I've been pretty consistent. I've only skipped 1 week since I started. So come the new year, I'm giving myself some flexibility. So if I switch to every 2 weeks, or maybe just there's a week you don't hear from me, I'm not going anywhere. The podcast isn't going anywhere. It's not disappearing. It's still here. It's just, got to take some time for me sometimes. And remember that while I'm doing this, I also have a full-time job that I have to do. And while this probably takes up 5 to 10 hours of my week every week to do this realistically, at the caliber that I'm doing it now and at the way that I've got it kind of down to a science, I still got a full-time job. And I have a life. So I'm doing my best here. But I'll be back. I shouldn't say next week. I should give myself the grace to say I'll be back with a new chapter soon of the Isle of Artemisia, hopefully a better chapter, a more well-rounded, well-edited, well-curated chapter that hopefully leads us closer to the finale of this season so that we can get on to a new story, because I came up with 3 synopsises with 10 chapter outlines for each for this novel writing company, and they turned 2 of them down and only wanted 1 of them, and so I'm going to tell them no and just use them for myself. So with all that said, I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you watching, however you consume this media. If you want to get in contact with me, you want to say, hey, where's the new episode? You can tweet me at floorrejects on Twitter. You can email me, floorrejects@gmail.com. I'll respond. There's not that many of us out there, so I will respond. And without any further ado, I'm going to go because I have lots of work to do. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.